Good afternoon. This is always the toughest session when people are relaxing and digesting to get your attention. And I think we have the right panel to seize your attention, albeit we are dealing with a very, I would say, philosophical, sociological problem, question, and that is the question of identity. The question of identity has many dimensions. It has an ethnic component, a religious component, an associational and societal and a cultural component. All of these, in some measure and in some proportion, are part of every person's national or ethno-religious identity. The most interesting thing is how these identities are shaped by nation states, because both Ukraine and Israel have very large diasporas. Israel's outnumbering its population of Israelis by about 1 million to 2 million, in total 15 million. And Ukraine has a diaspora of about 15, maybe more, and a core population of 40 million. So the questions and issues that our distinguished speakers will address have relevance both for the Ukrainian Jewish diaspora in Israel, the Ukrainian diasporas scattered around the world. So the topic, even though it is of a more, I would say, abstract nature, but based on values and I would say values and concepts, is of great relevance for countries, young countries, or young nation states that are building their lives and their identities. We have 4 speakers, and I will first introduce them and then invite them each to speak for about 8 or so minutes, which would allow us to have a bit of time for questions and answers. Our first speaker will be Itamar Rabinovich, who has been a distinguished ambassador of Israel to the United States. I remember him from his many years as a very important public presence during his years of service in my home country in the United States. He has been the president of Hebrew University, Tel Aviv University, I apologize. He is a major scholar of Middle Eastern studies, an academic with all the major university presses having published his learned books, both on diplomacy and on issues ranging from Baathism to politics in many of the Israel's neighboring states, and is the president of the Israeli Institute. Our second speaker will be Andrew Srulevich, who is the Director for European Affairs of the Anti-Defamation League, which is the major organization in our country and globally dealing with intolerance, anti-Semitism, but also racism and other threats to national minorities and the rights of minorities. Our third speaker will be a member of Knesset from the Blue and White, Orly Froman, who will give us her perspectives as a leading Israeli politician. And finally, Berel Rodal, my colleague in the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, who has had a distinguished career both serving as a member of his government, his Canadian government, in issues like defense policy, and also was one of the pioneers in the negotiations that led to the North Atlantic Free Trade Area. So the floor is with Professor Ambassador Itamar Rabinovich.
Thank you. Thank you for this advance credit. I plan to speak obviously about global perspectives, not Ukrainian perspectives, but I could not resist the temptation of reading out to you an excerpt from an article published in the Israeli paper Haaretz a few days ago by one of its columnists called Anshil Pfeffer, who has recently published a biography of Benjamin Netanyahu. And the title is curious. It says, "It's time for Jews to embrace our Ukrainian identity." He begins by saying that until recently, when he was asked about the origins of his family, he would say Polish. But given recent events in both Poland and the Ukraine, in the Jewish context, he comes to the conclusion, I'll just read out to you the last paragraph. Historically, Jews from the western part of Ukraine considered themselves Polish, and those from Odessa and the eastern provinces were Russian. Ukrainian Jews, quote unquote, is a relatively new concept, but one whose time has come. I'm not quite ready to give up on my Polish roots, but I think it is time for those of us whose families lived in what is today Ukraine to add it as well to our melange of identities, לשנה הבאה בבוצ'אץ'. Okay, now, I read a few days ago in the New York Review of Books an analysis of the phenomenon in France of the yellow vests, the gilets jaunes. And in it, I read a description of what happened to the French Jewish philosopher Alain Finkielkraut last February. He stepped out of a taxi on the Boulevard Montparnasse on the left bank of Paris and was assaulted by, or accosted by a group of yellow vests who shouted at him, "Dirty Zionist," quote unquote, and "Go to Tel Aviv," quote unquote. He received a lot of support, including from the president of the French Republic, Emmanuel Macron, who stated that that is to say Finkielkraut, is not only an eminent man of letters, but symbol of which the Republic appeals to us all. Now, Alain Finkielkraut was born in 1949 to Jewish parents who came from Poland and became a very well-known philosopher and public intellectual. He's a member of that elitist body called the Académie Française. He is on television, that's why his face was familiar to the people of the Yellow Vests. This incident has some of the most important elements of what I'd like to say by way of talking about global perspectives on Jewish identity in the 21st century. Let's say, first of all, the rising anti-Semitism that has been discussed in the morning, the complex identity that our chairperson has referred to. I'm sure that if you'd ask Alain Finkielkraut who you are, what you are, he would either say French or French Jew. But our identity is not only defined by us, it's also defined by others, as many Jews found out in the 1930s and 1940s. So for the Yellow Vest, he's not a Frenchman, he's a dirty Jew. And of course, the intimate relationship between Jewishness and Zionism, or the State of Israel, go to Tel Aviv. That's, you don't belong here, you belong, if the Jews have a state, you should be there. So a very telling incident. And in looking at this unfolding century, what are the main themes that I see? I'd like to speak about three areas, let's say the United States, Western Europe, and Eastern Europe. In the United States is the easiest for Jews to have a hyphenated identity. You can be an American Jew because there are so many other hyphenated Americans. You could be American Irish, American Italian, or you could be an American Jew. It's not an ethnic nation, it's a civic nation composed, the idea of melting pot been abandoned a long time ago, and in a way it's been the easiest, and of course we have seen a flourishing and a very prestigious Jewish community in America until recently. I emphasize until recently. I'm going to explain why in a minute. Western Europe, after World War II, used to be pretty good. Again, liberal democracies in nation states like France and Italy, liberal democracy in a more complex country like Great Britain, a new Germany, first in West Germany, where Chancellor Kohl explicitly wanted Russian Jews to come to Germany because he said, Germany without a Jewish community is not a Germany, and we need to have a Jewish community in Germany. You should be proud and comfortable in being Jewish. And Eastern Europe, not so much the Ukraine, but places like Poland and Hungary that grapple with two problematic legacies, that of World War II and the collaboration with the Nazi and the extermination of the Jews, and the Zionist experience, which for many anti-Semites has been, quote unquote, an unwanted gift from Jewish activists in the Communist Party. That makes it much more complex, and that is why we see very problematic positions in the Polish leadership or by Orban in Hungary, and more broadly in Eastern Europe. So the 21st century does not bode well. England, we now see the Labour Party, which has anti-Semitic elements and a leader who cannot cope with that and cannot bring himself to do what he needs to do. In Great Britain, the issues of Jewishness and Zionism are totally conflated. It's not just a criticism of Israeli policy, it's a denial of the Jewish right to self-determination. The Jewish national state is not a legitimate state for many of the activists of the Labour Party. And should there be a new election, and should Mr. Corbyn be elected Prime Minister of England, it's going to be a very difficult time for British Jews. France, I began with the episode of Finkelkraut, and it's not the only one. Of course, particularly in France, but in several other European countries, we should add the Muslim element, which is openly hostile not just to Israel, but also to Jews. In the United States, with which I began, there are long-term developments that make it different. The population is changing, and the United States will cease to be, quote-unquote, a white country. The very large Black and Hispanic communities, they don't share what we call the Judeo-Christian heritage that is the root of liberal acceptance and sometimes warm attitude to Jews. There's a large-scale process of intermarriage, of assimilation, particularly of secular Jews into the general population. The whole issue of Jewish identity is going to be much more difficult in the United States. And the relationship between Israel, the nation state of the Jewish people, and Jewish diasporas is also undergoing severe strains. Ronald Lauder in the morning made reference to the fact that the position taken by recent Israeli governments and probably by the next Israeli government on issues of religion, recognizing the Jewishness of reform and conservative Jews and conversions is going to be even more of a problem, and this is the large majority of the Jewish population in the state. Among young American Jews, there is growing criticism of Israeli policy towards the Palestinians. The BDS movement, unfortunately, now has many Jewish activists on American campuses. It's not going to be easy in that relationship. So, the last years of the 20th century, the last part of the 20th century, was good for Jewish identity. The 21st century, my concluding words, is probably going to be much more difficult for quote-unquote Jewish identity. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's invoking the United States and the issues that confront Jewish life is a good introduction for Andrew Srulevich, who will be precisely speaking about the evolution and the differences between perceptions of identities among Jews in Israel and Jews in the United States, and which is, as you know, is the largest base of the Jewish diaspora and may number in equal number to the population of the Jewish population of the state of Israel. So.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, of course, also for getting my title as Director of European Affairs for the ADL. But I did want to thank the organizers for giving me a promotion to National Director of ADL in the program. Comes with quite a salary increase, I think, but I'm sure Boris Lushkin is good for it. So, again, our panel is really sort of general in scope, or say global in scope. So I did want to talk about identity issues for American Jews and for Israeli Jews, and looking at, not just because that together we're about 80% of the Jewish community globally, because here we actually have some data to compare. The Pew Research Center did surveys of the American Jewish community and the Israeli Jewish community and asked them more or less the same questions. And here's what they found. First, nearly all Jews in the United States and Israel say they are proud to be Jewish, and large majorities in both countries say they feel a strong sense of belonging to the Jewish people. But American Jews and Israeli Jews don't always agree about what it means to be Jewish. Now, both surveys asked Jews in both countries about 8 possible behaviors and attributes that could potentially be essential or important to their personal Jewish identity. And in both countries, the most popular answer, or the number one answer, was remembering the Holocaust. Now, of these 8 questions, American Jews and Israeli Jews were close on 3, and somewhat apart on 5. So the 3 that they were more or less close on, first, again, remembering the Holocaust, where 73% of American Jews said it's essential to what being Jewish means to them, and 65% of Israelis said the same. Now, living in Israel for Israeli Jews, or caring about Israel for American Jews, again, pretty close. For American Jews, it was 43% that said it was essential, and for Israelis, 33%. The last one was eating traditional Jewish foods. There wasn't so important in general, only 18% for Israeli Jews and 14% for US Jews, but it was still pretty close. So now let me go to where they were farther apart. The question of leading an ethical and moral life. For US Jews, 69% said that was essential. For Israeli Jews, to say, is that essential for being Jewish? 47%. Observing Jewish law, halacha, for Israeli Jews, 35% said that was essential. For US Jews, only 19%. Working for justice and equality. For US Jews, this was very important. 56% said it was essential to being Jewish. For Israeli Jews, 27%. Being intellectually curious, again, a big difference here. For US Jews, it was 49%. For Israeli Jews, 16%. And the last one, having a good sense of humor, again, important for American Jews, 42% said it was essential. For Israeli Jews, just 9%. Now, both groups were also asked about what being Jewish means to them in a different way, as sort of an open-ended question, to let them give any kind of answer they want. And the vast majority of Israeli issues cited connections with Jewish history and culture and community. In addition, 53% of Israelis said passing traditions on to children is crucial to their Jewish identity. Now, most American Jews, by contrast, didn't name even a single additional element as something that was essential to their Jewish identity. And there was one interesting difference on a question about what disqualifies a person from being Jewish. They asked, can a person who believes that Jesus was the Messiah be Jewish? In their understanding of what it is to be Jewish? In Israel, only 18% said yes. But in the US, it was almost double. 34% said you could be Jewish and believe in Jesus. So I think that may be where the humor part also comes in. So most American and Israeli Jews say you can be Jewish without observing Shabbat or even believing in God. The idea that being Jewish is more about ancestry or culture than about religion is held by 62% of Americans and 55% of Israeli Jews. Now, for only 15% of American Jews, they say being Jewish to them is primarily about religion, and that position is mostly held by Orthodox Jews. And then in both surveys, they asked respondents how important being Jewish is in their lives. And here, actually the numbers are pretty similar. In America, 46%, in Israel, 54%. Now, 20% of American Jews, said being Jewish was not important to them, compared to 10% in Israel. So that's the data. Again, just to circle back, the most important traits that American Jews cited for feeling essentially Jewish were remembering the Holocaust, leading an ethical life, working for justice, being intellectually curious, and having a good sense of humor. Let me stop
there. We get another Israeli perspective now from Orly Froman. I'd invite you to take the dais.
With your permission, I will speak in Hebrew, my Jewish identity language, and you will have the translation. אחר הצהריים טובים. אני מאוד מתרגשת ושמחה להיות כאן בכנס הזה כחלק מהמשלחת הישראלית.
As part of the Israeli delegation, I am very pleased to represent the Israeli parliament as a newly elected member of the parliament. I was elected almost a week ago. We are here, but our heart is there in Israel. With the residents of Israel, with everybody who live in Israel, the families of those who were killed, who were injured, we help them. So let's wish them a fast recovery. I am a teacher, and I've been for a long time Director, Minister of Culture and Sport. I want to share my perspective as someone who grew up in a Jewish family, but based on a tradition. But we also had around small kids from Poland and Romania. I grew up in a family where traditions had always been an integral part of our life, and I saw that everybody who had been born a Jew had been born with certain Jewish value among all the Jews of the world. There is a real thread of our Jewish identity and our people that has been keeping our history for thousands of years. It's a unique and special identity always wins when there are threats and difficulties, and there's always ground of strong and invincible. Jewry, in my eyes, is not only about religion, not only nationality. It's mainly about culture and education. A culture that in its value has turned into something universal, like Ten Commandments, like don't steal, don't kill, respect the next your next of kin. We know that this task is no simple. Jewry is also about justice and taking care about those who are weaker than us. Jewry is about pluralism. They all say the Jews all take care about their next of kin because this is our integral part to think about our roots since we got the Torah. We have been able to discuss it and hand down this knowledge from generation to generation, including all facts having to do with this. The Dutch Shimon Peres, Israeli president, said once that the larger contribution of Jews into the world is the desire to live, and this is something that always make us search what to improve and what to create. In the 21st century, people realize that the Jewry is much more than just praying and keep 2 commandments. There are a lot of people who are there for us. Jewry is also manifested in all spheres, including society and culture, and determines a large part across the whole Jewish world. We must involve all our resources to implement all this factor. And I think I want to say maybe the most important, also in the days when there was no internet, before the state of Israel was founded, we could find in each Jewish community similar customs, similar history after thousands of years of expiry. And after we founded our state of Israel, it is very important to make sure that Jewish communities don't feel limited, alone and remoted one from another. The unity of the state of Israel, its people, is extremely important. It's not the only thing which is said about. For us, it's not always important what the Goys will tell about us or what the Jews will do. We are people of deed. That's why we must create links between us and make sure that nobody forgets, that we don't forget one other. My dear Jews, across the world, you are our force. You are those who help us, those due to whom the state of Israel is developing. I appreciate your efforts. As a new elected member of the Knesset, I also must make sure that the Israeli people are always on your side. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. We are very grateful for such a substantive contribution. And it occurs to me that you made the reference to the internet, but in a sense, the diasporas are a kind of a human web of tradition, values passed through families, communications by various means, travel back to the homelands and to their communities. So that was the first World Wide Web. I think we can take claim for that the diasporas were the first World Wide Web. And now, for the last intercession before a little bit of time for questions and discussion, my colleague Berel Rodal.
Well, thank you, Adrian. As Ronald Lauder began by saying, I'm throwing my notes away, and everything that might have been said on the subject has been said by the previous speaker, including by the chairman. So I'll speak extempore. I think of the great Jonathan Miller. Jonathan Miller is a playwright, surgeon, writer, Shakespeare producer, and a hostile Brit said to him, I say, Miller, are you a Jew? And Miller scratched his head and said, well, he said, Jewish, which I think was a brilliant reply and gets... Yeah, they're hard for the translators to translate. But identity is objective, but even more importantly, at times subjective. So we use so many different terms to identify phenomenon. For example, we talk about family, religion, community, tribe, citizenship, nationality, cultural, ethnie, the universal versus the particular. So let me focus on two words that are central in Jewish identity, traditionally, and looking forward. One is the word zachor, remember. It's an obligation, a commandment in the scriptures, remember. And part of being Jewish for many people is bearing witness, which includes remembering. The other big word is continuity. Who is a Jew? The person whose grandchildren will be Jewish. So let's take those as a beginning of the discussion. Now, Adrian and I have the privilege of being two of the co-founders of the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter Initiative. An aspect of Ukrainian Jewish identity is represented by the uniform worn by our talented UJE staff. I wonder if one of you would, maybe Svetlana, would stand up, model the UJE mixed Ukrainian Jewish symbol, or Angelica, or someone. So I hope you've all had an opportunity to admire what a Ukrainian Jewish identity could look like. And I did want to speak about Ukrainian Jewish identity in particular. So one of the people who was a member of the advisory board of the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, which I happen to have the honor of chairing, he's no longer with us, alas, was the writer Amos Oz. And Amos had the view, great writer, Amos had the view that what the Jewish people will become, what Jewish culture will be formed by whatever is created in Israel, not what is created in the diaspora. The diaspora has more brilliant individuals. But in his view, diaspora is barren. Nothing creative for the future will come out of it. That will happen out of Israel. We'll see. We'll see. I want to jump to the end point of what I will be talking about, and that is the difference between a view of identity that is fixed and objective. Classically, the view of halachic definitions of who is a Jew. Anyone born of a Jewish mother is Jewish. Elvis Presley is as Jewish as I am or as Rabbi Black is. He's more Jewish, okay. There's a big Magen David on his mother's gravestone in Graceland. The other is much more subjective, open, fluid, and what I'm suggesting is changeable, variable. It depends on time, it depends on context, it depends who is asking, what the setting is, and might well change radically in future. One of the places I'm suggesting where Jewish identity and Ukrainian identity are likely to change is in this place, in Ukraine, which is undergoing radical cultural evolution and change. We hope it continues. but it may produce interesting variations on themes. At the risk of offending Rabbi Bloch, my dear friend, I want to just give you an illustration of how fluid identity can be. We all, I'm sure, think that King David is important. The concept of a Messiah, right, descended from David, central to our religions. But what is the origin? We read the story of Tamar and Judah. I don't know if, I'm not going to go into the whole business of the story, but Tamar is a Canaanite woman whose two husbands, sons of Judah, leave her childless. She dies without children, and Judah's not prepared to give up his third. She tempts him, goes with him, and the union of that otherwise bizarre union is a prince named Boaz. Boaz gets together with a Moabite princess named Ruth. Ruth is the model of what a convert should be. Where you go, I shall go, your people will be my people. So we're being told, I'm telling this story very briefly, we're being told that the very definition of Jewishness, Am Yisrael Chai, a King David, is descended from two non-Jewish women, a Canaanite woman from village and a Moabite princess. With the broader messages about the fluidity of identity, but it's that core identity doesn't say it all. Boosting mankind to a higher level, a different orbit, requires energies that come from the outside. Tradition is very important. I'm not recommending anybody do anything radical and unkosher, God forbid, but that special occasions, special purposes are served by new additional forces that come from the outside. May be such a place. It has been in Ukraine. May one day again be in Ukraine. We can't think too conventionally about the subject of identity, not too fixed away. So when we think about continuity of peoplehood, a very good example, I'll be very brief, do I have a minute? Take Beit HaTfutzot, a very important Israeli institution known as the Diaspora Museum. The concept of the museum was disaster called diaspora. Very bad things happen, and the end result, when you come to the conclusion of your tour of the museum, it's the Holy Land. The logic being, that's where we belong, that's the evolution. That's changed now. It's now called the Museum of the Jewish People, and it's being radically rethought. So if you think in terms of peoplehood, how do you best protect peoplehood, define it, and advance it? Is it by being super strict? We have to make sure that everybody's following the same objective rules, otherwise we will never know who is Jewish. Or is it by being welcoming, by being open, by being flexible? I believe my argument would be that we're better served by being welcoming, relatively less judgmental, while still bearing important things in mind. And as we think about the evolution of Jewish communities, and we think of the joint evolution of Jewish communities and this country, Ukraine, let's bear the important messages of accommodation, understanding, flexibility in mind. And I think Ukraine has made a very good new beginning. Oh, one bit of advertising. One of our products is called A Journey Through the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, from antiquity to 1914. You can get it, no charge, outside at our door. Volume 2 is in preparation.
Thank you, Berel. So we've been relatively disciplined, and we started a few minutes late. We have time for a couple questions or brief comments. Anyone from the floor? Questions? Questions are comments with a question mark. Please, very briefly.
Большое спасибо.
problems. This is the history or culture or religion. This is all about Jewish identity. And when we're just talking how to solve this problem, I would like to ask your advices. For 20 years before Holocaust in Ukraine, we had pogroms, disaster, tragedy. And according with all that history, this tragedy was very close to the genocide because we had a lot of victims and a lot of criminals who did it. So, and the question is, what do you think? Can we put this, rise up these questions and to solve these questions as one of the main US problem?
We have Holocaust. Why do you need another genocide? Mr. Levitas once said that each people have a right for their disasters. So we've chosen Holocaust. So are we lack of disasters? So are we trying to look for something else? We've suffered enough.
Was whether events during the revolutionary period, pogroms, were a precursor, were another genocide as a precursor to the Holocaust. But I would say that since this panel is about Jewish identity, I would, maybe if anyone wants to engage, it was very clear that the Holocaust is one of the single most important signifiers for Israelis and for American Jewry. And my question is, maybe to put it into a Ukrainian context, is this, if there is a national tragedy, for example, the Holodomor, the Stalin mass repressions, as well as the Holocaust on this territory, is it advisable or a useful core of building a national identity for Ukrainians themselves to significantly honor and pay attention to their own sufferings as a part of their kind of building of their national identity? Does anyone want to tackle that? Because I want to keep it in the spirit of what we're talking about, national identity.
No, very briefly, it can be one element in a composite. It cannot be the single or even the dominant, but it definitely needs to be part of the package, part of the heritage, not just because of the past, but because of the present and potentially the future.
Any other takers?
Milovan Gilas asked, what is the most difficult task that can confront a communist? His answer was, to predict the past. So the past is essential, and how it's incorporated defines the nature of the society. So part of the evolution, I'm not prescribing what Ukrainian society must look like in future, but I think my Ukrainian cousins and colleagues would say that, and we spoke about this earlier today, that a treatment that incorporates, there shouldn't be competitive victimhood, but there should be an understanding of how bad things can be without the correct social, societal controls and proper historical understanding. So the answer to your question is, of course, it's all necessary. And as Itamar says, in balance.
Any further? One last. Or are you breaking my session up? Are you taking over?
I'm old enough to remember Yiddish spoken on the streets of Kyiv, right across the street in Botanical Gardens or in Shevchenko Park. I am young enough to hear more and more Hebrew spoken in Kyiv. My question is, how important is the language, or rather languages, for Jewish identity? Because there are several Jewish languages. And of course, we know that many Jews speak other languages as well.
Most Israelis would say it's essential that not all, but as many as possible, Jews would command Hebrew. To be realistic, it's not going to happen. And we just have to realized that we need to live in a world where the Jewish people uses several languages, where the lingua franca of the world and of the Jewish people is more and more English. You know, I participated a few years, about a decade ago, in the first Israeli-Polish strategic dialogue. That was the night when President Kwasniewski flew here to Kyiv to negotiate in the revolution. And I was head of the Israeli delegation, and I began by saying that my grandfather, who lived and was buried in Galicia, Polish Galicia, would never have thought that the common language to Poles and Jews would be English. But there we were.
Thank you. And one last question back at the far end, yes.
There was a question having to do with the problem of American Jewry, in particular that there are lots of American Jews, especially who live in major cities, who have left political views, try not to see themselves among the Jews. They leave the Jewish people to declare themselves as advocates of the global approach to the origin, and many of them even perceive Israel as a country of apartheid. I have personal acquaintances like this. Is there any scheme or program or system of what we could all do together as Jewish organizations to make sure that at least a part of these people get back to people like the American Jews helped us at some point in the past to get back to our sources? Да, это интересный вопрос.
Urban settings in the United States, there's a large part of the Jewish community which tends to the left and tends to move away from its ethnic, cultural roots, and with time lose more and more connection and simply accept more global identities. We had that same experience living under the Soviet Union, where we were moved away from our initial cultural identity. Is there something in the experience of how we were brought back into the fold that could be useful to bring back those Jews that are losing, through various ideological means, their identity in the contemporary world? That's a tough question. You want to take a shot at it?
Well, I will just say I don't think it's all necessarily about the politics. I mean, I think there is intermarriage, there is low rates of affiliation, which for the next generation then becomes more and more sort of a sense of attrition. But there are programs that have been started. Birthright is probably the best known among them. There are programs, for example, Jewish day school is very expensive in the United States. And because of our principle of separation of church and state, we cannot have government subsidies for Jewish day schools. But there have been now Hebrew, they're called charter schools. They're basically publicly financed, but privately managed, usually on certain themes. It could be on science, it could be on art, languages, and Hebrew is now one area where in the American Jewish community, they are trying to have, there are schools in New York, in Washington, in California, to have children learn Hebrew there, again, in a public school atmosphere. So that is one other way that there's an attempt to try to maybe arrest this attrition, which we do know about, we do care about, and is probably the #1 concern among American Jewry today. It's this issue of continuity.
So thanks very much. As I said, we were beginning with a very abstract concept, but often abstraction and substance don't come together. But I want to thank the panel for lending a lot of substance to the discussion, and thank you all for being attentive after lunch. Thank you.
And of course, this wouldn't have been possible without Adrian Karatnycky, the moderator, Give him a bigger hand. Dear ladies and gentlemen, we are now into the next panel discussion, the Jewry in Modern World, Jewish Demographic Challenges in Israel and Diaspora. And I invite to this stage Professor Zeev Khanin. He is Chief Scientist of the Israeli Ministry of Immigration and Absorption, Associate Professor, Ariel University, Academic Chairman, Institute for Eurasian Jewish Studies in Herzliya, and also Samuel Kliger, Director of Russian and Eurasian Affairs of American Jewish Committee. And I'm really pleased to introduce the moderator. He's Vlad Davidzon, author at Tablet Magazine and chief editor of the Odessa Review, a person who is very, very international and, if I may say so, still Jewish. Yes? Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, это работает? Does this work? Okay, great, thank you. Hello all, thank you for having us. My name is Vladislav Davidson. Thank you to the Kyiv Jewish Forum, to our friends in the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, our friends who came before us, and our friends who will come after us. So I am wearing a couple of hats. My Ukrainian hat, I am the chief editor of the Odessa Review. My American hat, my more international hat, is I'm an American journalist. One of the things that I do is cover Jewish-Ukrainian relations, and I am Tablet Magazine's European culture correspondent. I'm sure you all read Tablet because it's, I think, the best English language Jewish publication in the world. I'm glad my friends and colleagues from Haaretz are not here. Certainly our friends from the Forward are not here. I'm stepping in for Mr. Chaim Ben Yaakov. Okay, so before I introduce my two pals, Professor Zeev Khanin and Sam Kliger, I want to tell you a little bit about the little quick discussion we had before here, trying to decide which languages to do this in, a panel on contemporary, Russophone, Jewish, transnational relationships, demographics, identity. We weren't really sure. One of us, I was born in Uzbekistan. My grandparents are Ukrainian Jews, but I was born in Uzbekistan. I'm an American. I live in France. We have a Ukrainian-born Israeli and a Russian-born American. So what do we speak when we're together alone? Us post-Soviet Jews, just sitting alone and having a conversation. Obviously, we'll speak Russian to each other. But here, in Kyiv, on this date, on this auspicious date, in this tremendous forum that we're having for the first time, you know, all three of us speaking Russian here when we speak other languages, and we all speak English perfectly well to each other also, didn't seem correct. So what we decided to do is that I'm going to do the introduction in English. The two gentlemen are going to deliver their reports in Russian, so get your earphones ready if you're not a Russophone attendant. And then the Q&A we're going to do in whichever language people want to ask questions in, Ukrainian, Hebrew, Russian, English, whatever you like. So, Mr. Zeev Khanin is going to go first. He is the chief scientist of Israeli Ministry of Immigration and Absorption. He's also an associate professor at Ariel University, academic chairman of the Institute for Eurasian Jewish Studies in Herzliya. He has recently completed a very, very, very interesting report on the demographics of Jews worldwide, and especially in Israel. And as far as I know, when he goes to different forums in the post-Soviet world, he tailors the report that he gives to the locals. So in Belarus, he spoke about the Belarusian Jewish situation. In Russia, he spoke about the Russian situation. Mr. Sam Kliger, who's a lovely gentleman, has been the director of Russian and Eurasian Affairs of the American Jewish Committee for many years. The last time we were together, it was he who was hosting me in New York 2 years ago. So I'm very glad that the shoe is on the other foot now, sir. So without any further ado, Professor Khanin.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Okay, we were requested to switch from English into Russian. I remember my first rector on Tel Aviv University, while I started to teach after Aliyah, Professor Itamar Rabinovich, who spoke here a few minutes ago, who was also tolerant enough to permit us to teach in English first year and then switch into Hebrew. So now I'm going to switch from English into Russian. Окей, итак, дамы и господа, я подготовил небольшую презентацию, с вашего разрешения. Я не знаю, в какой степени это будет работать.
Presentation, I have no idea whether it works, but I hope it will work. But this presentation would devote to the demographic resources of the modern Jewry world. This is the main issue of our forum, the Jewry of Ukraine, Jewry of global content. How can there exist as the creation? So, well, how we can talk about the role and the goal of Jewry, and whether do we have the demographic potential for future generation, talking about the Jewish activity and Jewish structures for future. So let's talk what we're gonna talk about. So, well, I will talk and assist what I can see on screen. So as you've seen, ladies and gentlemen, for the current moment, we do have the Jews diaspora, which is exists outside of Israel. So, well, this is the Serge de la Mirroc talks, etc. All the demographic scientists, they say that we have 8,100,000 Jewish people living outside of Israel. From one side, it was 1/3 of this diaspora is located in the Northern America, in Canada. So, other words, the discussion about language, definitely English. So, diaspora speaks English. And from another side, talking about the share of that communities we are representing right now. So that means the so-called the communities from Europe and Asia. So, well, they are only 10%, even less than 10% living in that areas of the so, well, you can see those who are in accordance with the return requirements, low and return requirements, those who are just dealing with the third generation. So half of you Jewish people, you know, quarter of Jewish. So, well, I would like to apologize because I'm not be so-called politically correct. So, well, I will use the incorrect terms. Sorry for that. So, well, you can see that about a few millions people, and we understand that not so many of them would return to Israel, but it's a kind of a potential for us, and it's a kind of a potential for Jewish activity in diaspora's words. And observing the structure of diaspora, one can see that we do have about 14 million Jewish, ethnic Jewish people, as we say, the core of the Jewish population of CJP. So, well, about two big centers, Israel and United States, this is the core center. And so if we're talking about the diaspora mainly speak English, and Israel speaks mainly Hebrew. What's going on with Aliyah? So, well, the element united them, the Institute of the Modern Jewish Life. The very important thing is Aliyah. Aliyah mainly speak Russian, so, well, 3/4 that just speak English, and at least others those who came from the former Soviet Unions. So, well, this Aliyah speak Russian. The third phenomenon and they speak Hebrew. So this is three main languages. So, well, three main languages are the official language of our conference. So, well, talking about the main reasons, so, well, you can see the data of the survey of the Ministry of Aliyah. So, well, what is the motivations for them for last 5 years, last 10 years? So you can see that for last few years there are few reasons, but in the diasporas we can say about the different data. We got this survey, we just finished it, we just made the survey in 4 different countries, in Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldavian Republic. So, well, you can see the results that the largest population still in Russia. So about 180 people of the core of the Jewish population living there. I mean, all the different categories, including the specific categories and those people who just, within this category on return. Those who are in accordance with the return, it's about 600,000. Then about 60% of the post-Soviet area. It's about 1/4 in Ukraine, more than 200,000 expanded Jewish population. Then Moldavian Republic, then Belarus, and others who are living in this Caucasian area and Central Asia is about 60%. So we'll live about the identity. So this is the main resources of the Jewish activity. What is the share of this core population, and what is the expanded population? What is the Jewish identity about this Jewish people? As you've seen, if we can analyze the United States, then you can see that despite of the fact that we do have the already existed understandable things, that the Jewry of United States, they accept the Jewry as the religious categories, but in practice it's not true. But the very specific share of the Jewish people, they are not identifying themselves religiously, but by nationality. Mr. Zeev says the United States, for many years, religion was the facet of ethnicity. So this is exactly the translation. So he said there was a facade of the ethnic identity. Religion was like that. So about 80% of the American Jewish people, they were third, fourth generation of the Eastern European the Jewish people. And the Jewish population in Canada mainly consists of the former USSR Jewish people. And that's a kind of additional elements to prove this point of view. So we can talk endless about different denominations, but talking about the identity, or what we call the identified leftovers, then I think it's a kind of a point to talk about. So what's going on in Ukraine? So well, this is the results of our survey and of our research. So we'll just finish in March of 2019. For 15 years it was just the unique research, and that's why we would like to offer you to use these results for our discussions. So well, I want to say that for the last few years the universal Jewish identity unfortunately dramatically decreased, and 15 years ago the figure was that special, that the majority of the people, they just called themselves the Jewish. Now you can see it's a kind of enforcing of the so-called particular regional Jewish identity. So for example, you can see Russian Jews, Moldavian Jews, Belarus Jews, etc. They are dominating. In Russia it's about 2 times higher than the rest, and in Ukraine it's about 1.5 times higher. In Israel, that's a process of the very fast integration. So it's a kind of Israel Jewish identity. So and about more than a third, they just accept themselves as the Russian Jewish people. So in the former Soviet Union was the divergency processes, and it was like that. But in Kazakhstan, etc., that's a different process. Those who are from that former CIS republics, they are just integrating in the Israel-Russi without any connotations, any connections with the state as it is, etc. So you can see we do have the double identity principles of that people. So those who just accept themselves Russian and non-Jewish. There was mutual exclusions for that, but you have to be a Russian or Jewish. And now, taken into consideration the so-called mixed marriages, we can say that it could exist, and that's also, as you have seen, at least you can see those who just, tell that they do not have any identity. It's a kind of a challenge, but it's a kind of a resource too, talking about the demography. What we're going to do with this? So we just decided to make some calculations. So we had then survey and we asked about a few thousand of respondents. So you can see the Jewish identity, the various ethnic origin in Ukraine, and you can see that 100% pure Jewish were calculated based on the 3 or 4 grandparents. Parents of the parents, and one of fourth, etc. And then those so-called members of the families, those of so-called mixed family, etc. So we just, analyzed all that figures. And as you've mentioned, among 100% pure Jews people, they are dominating the so-called particular universal so-called regional identity, 35 and 32%. So those who are half Jews, those who just accepted themselves like Ukrainian Jewish people, so they say that we hope that we do have more and much in common with Ukraine than with the Jews living in Ethiopia or United States. So you can see the very high share. So you can see the people, those who are accepting themselves more Jewish or more Russian. So you can see the big group of those who are mainly with the particular identity. So what is very interesting, almost 1/3, they prefer. They are not providing us the final answer. And the popular version is that I am the person without any connections with religion or ethnic origin. It's a kind of a problem. It means that people should not refuse even to answer to the different questions. The interviewer asked them different questions. Are you ready to answer to the different questions? And they said no. So they didn't say it doesn't matter for me so well, but the majority, they preferred not to provide the final answers about the origin, who I am. So that means what? I am just open for the different proposals. So what and from where we can get any proposals? This is the question. And maybe these questions could come from the transnational Jewish diaspora, from Eurasian diaspora, from other Jewry living in the different continents and areas. Russian diaspora is located in 55 countries in the 5 continents of the globe, and as you've seen, more than a half, almost 60%, and about they say that there is a phenomenon like that, and they are not ready to identify themselves with Russia, but they can be easily identified with a transnational diaspora. And you can see also the analysis dealing with the age. All that things quite popular among the different ages. So it's a kind of a challenge. Yes, it's a challenge. Let's observe another resources, aspects of the Jewish identifications in Ukraine. What does it mean? And now to be Jewish. It's a structure, and then you can find the answers. For oldest, it's genetic biologically things, so to be born in Jewish family, to have Jewish parents, etc. So for the middle-aged, please, for the middle people, and for the youngest, it is more diverse. So to be proud to have the connections to the community, to understand what does it mean tradition, what does it mean culture, etc. So what does it mean at least to be a Jewish person. So and then if we will continue to deal with them, they will be Jewish only when we will continue to educate them and using the principles of Jewish education. So another thing, importance that you, future children and grandchildren, will feel Jewish. So and we can analyze all the digits, and then more homogenic the ethnic origin is, the more they say yes. But you can see that some, they have no roots, Jewish roots, but 40% they always say. It's a kind of a challenge, but it's also the possibility. Another thing, just talking about the religious identity versus religious affiliation. And what is the possibility, the ambivalent answer? So, well, the Ukrainian community provided us the very specific.
The answer is interesting. We have seen that very few of them said that they think themselves religious. However, religion as a culture is quite acceptable thing. So the question was something like this. It is the answer to a previous question. You're religious. What religious do you think is yours? Christianism, Judaism, Buddhism, Islam, and what? And you can see that those who call themselves religious, half of them stated my religion is Judaism, 10% Christianity, 15 both in the same sense. The more religious people are, the more often they mention Judaism among this list of, let's say, religious and cultural background for their national or ethnical Jewish identification. Here in Ukraine, Jewish identity is ethnical. There's to throw away from Jewish team that remains still exists, at least all generation of Jews. I must end now. So, but a couple of figures my main claim is following. Today, transmission of Jewish tradition practices is not in families, as in the framework what we call organized Jewish activity. That's why we've come together all this to think how to organize this. So you can say latest and challenge the more homogeneous Jewish origin, more actively are respondent involved in Jewish activity. But most important is the age break. You can see that the active in Jewish activity in Ukraine are involved the older generation and the youth. It's clear the youth study, have more time, pensioners don't work, have more time, free time. Whereas these carriers of those practices, what we call average middle age and advanced average age, I think that Jewish organizations should pay attention to that. We can also see the difference between communities in major cities and in towns. So I can see that in Kyiv, more than half say that they, in one way or another, involved in activities Jewish organizations in such cities, and more than one-third, about 40%, and one-third of peripherally Jewish communities, seemingly where people are seeing are on display. It's funny that in contrast to the situation in Russia, we could see in Moscow and St. Petersburg we had a large number of people, about 20% who state in my city there's no Jewish activity. How you say it in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Speaking of Ukraine, we can see that Jewish activity is more on display. I must come to an end of my presentation. One other point is, I would say, Israel. So I missed one slide, but solidarity with Israel is the fact that may cohesion between the Jewish countries. I speak about negative influence, to what extent anti-Semitism, which was the source of maintaining Jewish identification in the Soviet Union. And in the first stage, after the demise of the Soviet Union, to what extent this subject is relevant today. Well, pay attention that in the whole, about 20% reported, one-fifth, that Ukraine anti-Semitism has either grown or considerably dropped. This to mutually including points of view, and 40% found no special changes. But on the other hand, only 3% reported that there has not been, and there's no anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is actually perceived as a challenge, and when it is perceived as a challenge, then to which extent it channels the attention of Jews and their families inside the Jewish community, or does it encourage them to distance? And I think that Slava Lukashov will give more qualified evaluation of this approach, but this some sense exists, and honestly, I wouldn't neglect this. Thank you for attention.
Thank you for that really remarkable report. Спасибо за этот крайне интересный доклад. Mr. Kliger.
Thank you, Vlad. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to present on behalf of American Jewish Committee. Now I'm trying to switch my switcher in my head and to switch into Russian, because we agreed that this panel will be presented in Russian language.
And the individual part, diaspora, like American Jewry, Ukrainian Jewry, etc., as pointed, yes, indeed, 90% of all Jews living in the world today live in two countries, Israel and the United States. So don't speak about Ethiopia, please. Well, just a comparison was unsuccessful, and the rest was okay. And perhaps it could sound as disappointed for someone. I want to be correct, like they have taught me, and say that whether or not you want it, interest of Jewish people today and the nearest future will be determined by these two communities, Israelis living in Israel and a part of Jewish people living in the United States of America. Not only because they account for the overwhelming majority, but also because they are the, let's say, most leading part of the Jewish people. It's not approach to either Ukrainian Jewry or rather national diasporas, nonetheless these effects. So what is your Jewish interest all about? When you speak about interest, we mean three components of this interest. Component one is safety and survival, which have always been part of Jewish life. Second interest is economic security, economic prosperity, and economic well-being. And the third point is transition of values from one generation to another. Tell the son of yours, which is part of Testament. These 3 points which Jewish people in Israel try to implement: security, economic prosperity and transition is something that other communities try to. Of course, there are different specific interests in Ukrainian Jewry, in American Jewry, among the Jews in Argentina. By the way, in Ethiopia, they have their specific national interests, but these above-mentioned three components are also present. Who determines the Jewish interest? Is not myself who should speak. Tell you specifics about Jewish people. 3 Jews mean 4 minds, and 5 Jews means 10 minds. This condition inside the Jewish people. Nonetheless, in spite of this large number of conditions, which is this unique ability of the Jewish people to self-determine, to determine their interests and pursue it, even with the absence of high power, the absence of the state of Israel. The Jews had lived 2,000 years without the state of Israel, nonetheless being able to ensure their survival, security, economic prosperity, and the task of transition of values. That's why these 3 components are still in force today. Speaking about the future of the Jewish people, then this interest will be determined by Jewish leaders. Because with all respect to demography and social science, I'm a social science myself, we are all aware that the ability of the Jewish people to self-organize is unique despite a huge number of conditions in communities, groups, various Jewish organizations. Despite everything, the unique ability to unite and create self-developing systems is a great gift of destiny with God providence behind it. So one of the challenges is educating leaders of the new generation that will determine as a team the Jewish interests. Thank you for attention.
Each other, actually. You're already doing that, even without me asking. Okay, Professor, I'd like you to tell me what relationship Russian-speaking Jews in Israel will have in the future with Russian-speaking Jews in Ukraine and Russian-speaking Jews in America, of which we're many. And I'd like you to get into some sort of discussion and maybe even combative argument with Mr. Kliger, and maybe in the process make fun of Ethiopia again.
Ну, прежде всего, я должен, оставляя в стороне великодержавный американский шовинизм.
Aside American chauvinism of Dr. Kliger in relation to Ethiopian Jews and Israel, bearing in mind the circumstance that 95% of Ethiopian Jews live in Israel, so it's an attempt on my countrymen. It's having go with my countrymen. So I can answer a question following way. We can say that in today's the first generation of Jews who come from Soviet Union, wherever they end up in Israel, United States, Europe, or stay in the place of their residence, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, etc., etc. This level of realization themselves as part of transnational society is quite high. One reason is the fact that as of today, there is no Russian-speaking Jew who wouldn't have next of kin in Israel, United States, and Germany. children, grandchildren, grandma, grandpa, you name it, something that makes us having to do with everything that happens in this country. When we're behind this control, we ask each other, missiles are dropped on our land. I happen to speak Lok in the United States and Diaspora in Canada and former USSR, and situation in Israel evokes a great interest, and I think that it's the source of the solidarity with Israel, and it's probably a negative point or less good news is the fact that the more we can see decreasing desire to be involved in the activity of Israeli support in raising funds and promoting campaigns, etc. So something we could think about. And the second point is, I think that at some point in the past, the well-Jewish economists took a correct decision given to outsourcing the activity on a regional basis, European activity to a European Jewish Congress, etc., etc. But as by doing so, we're losing transnational communities of Jews who come to various parts of the world, if I correctly understand the question. And the third point, I would say, I think that after all, there's been a divergence, not convergence, in the former USSR countries. Local Jewish communities are formed based on the strengthening local Jewish identity. In Israel, we can say convergence. But I think that in a generation we will see considerable differences in mentality, in identification, in interest, and in system values between three major Jewish communities in Israel, North America, and former USSR, where demographically important communities will exist. Should we contradict this? How Dashendrovich says. His old joke. No, I'm going to retell this. There's a punchline. It should not be counteracted. We should head it. So whether or not we'll be able to head it, there's a question of Jewish leaders who will take the decision. A couple of minutes to you, Mr. Kliger. If you have comment. There's one other phenomena I'd like to add to what Zeev mentioned about identity. Yes, indeed, we can see this in the United States in large diaspora from the former USSR. Today we have about, based on my data, based on my conservative data, have 750,000 people come from the former Soviet Union. Well, I know. But that depends how we count with. If we take also Canada and North America as a whole, then it would be about 1 million people living in North America. And a very interesting type of identity is being formed that I call identity mix with which people live very comfortable. Basically, I'm Jew, but I'm a Ukrainian Jew, which is very fashionable today. If you're from Ukraine, there are Bukhara Jews, Georgian Jews. At the same time, I'm immigrant. At the same time, I'm American. At the same time, I speak Russian lately, and I feel comfortable in this mix and this cocktail. I'm doing well in this cocktail. In this cocktail, I have a component that prevails. If you take gin and tonic, sometimes a tonic prevails, sometimes gin prevails. But if you take a cocktail of 5 different things, then immigrant component might prevail, or cosmopolitan company might prevail. In general, I'm a man of the world. Yeah, my parents are Jews, but I'm higher than this. I'm higher than my Jewry. I'm just a man of the world. in our study, there were such answers like I am Jewish woman, and which is even more sub-identification, not just at level I am Jew, but I am Jewish woman. It's serious. So this new tendency to identify yourself at the same time by 4, 5, 6 parameters is very interesting tendency which will continue in the future.
У нас буквально, я думаю, на 2-3 вопроса есть время. Mr. Kulikov.
For a couple of questions.
As far as I remember your presentation, you put, or minimalist demographers, put the Jewish population of the former Soviet Union at 330,000 people, yes? However, today the press service of Mr. Zelensky quotes Rabbi Karatnycky, who says, at the moment in Ukraine, not less than 500,000 Jews live. Where is the truth? Who is closer to truth?
Well, the Jewish demography is very important and very interesting thing, especially due to the fact that probably that's the only science which is impossible either to reject or to prove anything. So we are talking about 3 different issues. We are talking about the Jewish population core, that means ethnic Jews. We are talking about their immediate relatives, including those with the Jewish roots who do not declare their Jewish identity, and we are talking about those who meet the regulations of the Israeli law of return. Shall I continue in English? Okay. And here we have this wonderful discussion. At the moment, while we are talking about the correlation between the core Jewish population and extended Jewish population, so demographers, especially Israeli demographers, they're talking about 1 to 2.2. That means you should multiply it into 2.2. Of course, the Jewish leaders do not agree with that, including Kvod Rav Kamenetsky, very distinguished Rabbi Kamenetsky, really respectful Jewish spiritual and political leader, community leader, and who believe that these correlations should be 1 to 4, 1 to 5, and even 1 to 6. Other Jewish leaders, especially in Russia, believe that it should be different in different regions. In Caucasus, it could be 1 to 3. In the Jewish autonomous region, it could be 1 to 7. Nobody knows. What all this story is about? The story is not just about politics, although that is also about politics. The huge and demographically important community is the more politically important this community is. But it also we are talking about some very organic and real phenomenon, which means that I would call it in Russian околоеврейская среда. That means the Jewish or near Jewish environment, which captures various persons that could be Jewish or not, that could feel Jewish as their major identity or not. But due to various reasons, they prefer to be inside rather than outside. This is actually a situational issue. Today, they believe they belong to. Tomorrow, they would decide that they're out of this community. So that's the question of political leaders. Some of them, like Rabbi Kamenetsky, succeeded to bring many of these people inside. In other places, Jewish communal leaders are less successful. But that's a very long answer to your very short question. So very short answer to your question is, I don't know and nobody knows.
Okay, that's a good answer. It's a very Jewish answer also. Do we have any more questions? Any more curious people, demographics? Okay, this gentleman over here. У вас есть микрофон? Можете помочь ему, пожалуйста?
Валерий Гилецкий из Молдовы. Я задам вопрос.
I'm going to ask the question in Russian. You both said, you said it's very good. One of the elements is handing down values. I think that handing down values is a very important element. How can you see it? You said that Mr. Kliger said it's like God's providence. How can you see this transition of values? Because being it's a very important element. How does it take place? Where to focus and what its perspective in the future? Thank you very much. It's a question. It's a question for $1 million. It would be more correct to say it would question $1 million if we're not questioned for many $1 million. What I would say is that we have a small portion of Jewish population where Jewish identification transferred from father to son, from mother to daughter, etc., etc. Today we can say quite a large group population. It was captured, but our captured as long ago as in the 90s when the group of population appears with non-heritage Jewish that mom and dad do not consider them Jews.
With regard this identity in synagogue, in the Sunday school, etc. So now the kids grown up. So well, they just got the very special motivation. We got the Aliyah from the former Soviet Union, so well, it was a kind of a very specific so-called mixtures of origin, so well, we had for that moment. But I would like to say that if we just, put all our expectations on the family, only on the family, it's not the goal to develop soul, but we have to deal with the Jewish activism. Jewish activism in different forms is extremely important, so I would like to encourage all the so-called network Jewish activity, which is very important, all the different structures and the platforms to meet, all that people, talk to each other through different networks, and I want to say that every lei, shekel, dollar, krone, every unit of currency investing into the Jewish activity and Jewish education would save Jewish people for us. Now I would like to add something to it, and I have 2 minutes left. And 30 seconds, please, and then the last questions from you, General. Thank you, Jan Privorotsky from Jerusalem and Kyiv, and from your hypergenic for the Kybergentonica. And then I would like to say that one of the Ukrainian politicians said that because Ukraine are different from Russia, so we do have here the bones of tzaddiks here in Ukraine, and Ukraine can get more from this, and then etc. So we'll have to understand that the roots of identity is here in Ukraine. So when we're just talking about the Jewish world, do you think is it interesting to know the Jewish past and to have it in Ukraine? So I'm not understand so well. We do have the righteous bones, the roots is here, and whether it's interesting to Americans and Jewish people. So, well, you just asked this question, and it's a part of the previous question. That's a kind of a transmission of the system of values. So, yes, I think this is very important question. It's for $1 billion question. It's a key moment, because from all that three parts of the Jewish interest, we do have this security and relatively security and the prosperity also for us with the hard power we got because Israel state existed and it was established and still exists, and we do have it, but the transmission of values, it's a big problem. And what is the transmission of values to tourism and the bones of righteous and etc. So we have to follow the principles Ukrainian Jewish things and the diasporas is the absolutely great part of the Eurasian diaspora, and So Rabbi Kamenetsky or demography, so everything is so very interesting. So we do have few 100,000 people living here in Ukraine, those who are connecting to the Jewish origin. So I said that determination of the future would be depends on the big communities of Israel and United States community. So they do have the huge resources, and Israel has the huge resources, and United States also has these huge resources, and the American Jewry, also Jewry, they have huge resources. But transmission of the values is the very important thing. So now I would like to say that talking about this, I would like to highlight that we do face the new tendency. We always say about the Jewish education, and what we have, there is no Jewish education, because there is no Jewish education, because yeshiva, it's a kind of a closed school, a very specific closed school for the Orthodox Jews, and those yeshivas, they are too expensive for the ordinary people. I mean, United States is too expensive. And then talking about the Sunday schools, they are not providing the very serious education. So facing the truth, let's say there is no Jewish education, but the Jewish activism, yes, it's true, it exists. So we just, came from Amut, from Belarus, and then we saw by our eyes that this organization is a kind of a self-organized system. So they are self-identifying themselves. They just, dealing with all the mistakes. They do not know a lot about the Jewish tradition, but they are self-identifying. I do not think that 2-3 people are very serious in studying Talmud, but not the rest among the 600. But they are identifying themselves through the activities of Limud. And I think that's the future regarding the different translation of the values. So for us, it's very important, and to get from family a lot, it's too complicated. And I would like to say a few words in addition. So in United States and in Israel, of course, there is a process of so-called revaluing, and that we are in the process of forming of the new type, and that's a kind of the country of Exodus, or Canada. We're talking of the elements of the tradition. So what type of elements could be used to form this identity? I mean, the graves of the righteous, or those heritage from the Zionism movement, or whatever. So it depends on the context. I was just talking about the graves of the righteous. It's very it depends, because sometimes it's become the New Age sectants movement. So it's not the just part of the Israel society. So we'll see. God is great. So we will see.
And thank the brilliant moderator Vlad Davidson.